Hey friends, what's up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Yud Beis, Daf 12 of Masechta Ksubis, friends. Well, today we talk more about this concept of Konsu b'chezkas besula v'nimtzeis beula and different permeations of that. So let's jump in. We're on Daf Yud Beis, Amud Beis. Oh, by the way, the dishwasher is running in the background. If you hear the dishwasher, it's because the dishwasher is running. I just cleaned out the fridge for the first time in a long time. There's some seriously moldy stuff in there. Alright, let's go weiter. So, says the Gemara in Daf Yud Aleph Amud Beis, all the way at the end of the third to bottom line. Tanu Rabbanan Konsu Rishon L'Shum Nisuin V'yesh La Edim Shel Nister Einam Minister V'lo Sha'asa Kedei Bia In Hasheni Yochol Liton Tainas Besulim Shari Konsa Rishon. Wow. Wowee. Wowee. Okay. Alright. Okay. No, let's read that again. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Konsa Rishon L'Shum Nisun. So you have Ruvain. Ruvain marries Sarah. Okay. V'yesh La Edim Shel Nister. But there are witnesses that there was never any yichud together. I don't know, maybe he dropped that at the wedding. I saw a story maybe last year or something, a very, very sad story, that there was like a groom at his wedding, like his friends like had him on a table or something, he Pasha fell off on the table and like died or something. So so imagine a situation like that, right? Like at the wedding, so they got married, but there are witnesses who can attest that there was no yichud room for whatever reason, there was no yichud. There are witnesses, right? V'yesh la'edim shelo nister. There are witnesses that there was never any yichud. So obviously, if there was no yichud, so maybe there was no bia. Minister of Losha Sakadei bia. Or maybe there are witnesses that we saw them in a secluded area, but they weren't in that space for long enough time that they could have had bia. So there are witnesses basically to attest the fact that she is a basula. Nonetheless, nonetheless, Reuven then died at his wedding or whatever it is. Right, he died before they had a chance to have bia. Shimon then marries her. Even though there are witnesses, now this is not Yevamis where Reuven and Shimon are related. They're not. Reuven and Shimon are two separate people, unrelated. Shimon now marries Sarah. Even though there are witnesses that Sarah and Reuven never had bia, nonetheless, Shimon is unable to wake up the morning after his chasana and say, or whatever, after they have bia, and say, what? I thought she was a basula. No, he can't say that. He cannot say that he thought he was marrying a basula because she was already married. In a chinamri, there are witnesses that said that there was no yichud or anything like that. Doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is, Shimon married a woman who was married before, and therefore he cannot assume that she is a basula. Now, even though he did marry her, assuming that she was a basula, right? There was witnesses that said there was never any yichud, so he married her b'chezkas basula, right? Konsu b'chezkas basula. He thought he was marrying a basula. It turns out that she's a beula. We say, forget it. She was married before. I know you thought you were marrying a basula. Fact of the matter is, she was married before. We have to treat her like an amana, and therefore Ksubis is only amana, right? So here we have a situation of Konsu b'chezkas basula. He thought he was marrying a basula. V'nim says beula. It turns out that she's actually a beula. And we're saying that the ksuba is 100 zuz, right? So Rabbi Zosomer konsu b'chezkas besula v'nim says bula yesh lo ksuba mona. So says Rabbi exactly that. So this says that you have Shimon who's marrying her, assuming that she's a basula, because the witnesses said that she's a basula. V'nim says beula, but it turns out that she's beula, and we're saying, she was married before. You have to assume that she's a beula, and therefore the ksuba is ksuba mana. The ksuba is a mana, and that would be like yesterday, like the opinion of Reb Chia bar Oven. Okay, fine. Ravashi Omar says, Ravashi, look, ba'almul olam ema lach leis la klal. Look, I'll say, in general, koncept chezkas beula besula v'nim says beula, she doesn't get a ksuba at all. Let's go back there for a second. V'shayin yocha shari koncept rishon, that it's different over here because she was already married. Right? Meaning, says Ravashi, look, I can make the argument that this is a unique case. In general, we would say, a fellow gets married, he thinks he's marrying a basula, it turns out that she's a beula, he had no clue. So maybe she shouldn't get a ksuba at all, because it's mekach tos. But this case, argues Ravashi, is unique in that she was already married before. Sure, there are witnesses that said that that there was never any yichud or whatever. But the fact of the matter is, he married a woman who was married before. So there's reason to argue that, it's not crazy to think that she's be'ula. And therefore, then maybe that's why in that case, her ksuba is 100 sus. But in a regular situation, where a fellow marries a besula and it turns out that she's a be'ula, so maybe then she wouldn't get any ksuba at all. Now, one second. Shouldn't we be concerned? Right? Meaning, we're saying in this case, right, that he married this woman and he thought that she was a besula. It turns out that she is a be'ula. Shouldn't we be? And we're saying, look, there's no chiddush over here. Right? The ksuba is a mana. Right? She was married before. Now there are witnesses who said that she never had bia with the first guy. Second, right? Shimon then marries her. Thinks she's a basula. Turns out that she's a be'ula. We say, look, she was married before, right? Of course, you should have assumed that. There's reason to assume that she's a be'ula, and therefore ksuba is a mana. But should we be concerned that maybe she had bia after the erusin with Shimon, right? So maybe she was married to Reuven. There are witnesses who said that they never had bia together. Then Shimon betrothed, is Mekadesh Sarah. Turns out that she's a be'ula. Don't we have to be concerned that maybe she had bia with somebody else after Shimon was Mekadesher? So v'nechoshem is in Satachtav, in which case she's asura to him. Where am I? So Omar Rav Sherevia Kugon Shakidish Uval Altar. So Sherevia says, well, it's talking about a situation where Shimon was Mekadesher and then immediately did Nisuin, immediately had bia, right? Meaning it's kind of like essentially similar to what we do nowadays, right? Erusin and Kiddushin all happens under the chuppah, right? There isn't any period between Erusin and Kiddushin. It all happens under the chuppah, right? The bracha that we learned about on Dav Zayin Amud Beis at the bottom, right? The Birkas HaErusin, right? What's it? She'asur lanu arayus v'hitir lanu senusus lanu the chuppah v'kiddushin. That happens under the chuppah nowadays, right? And then immediately afterwards, right? You're making the Birkas Chasanim. It's under the chuppah. There's nisuin. So there isn't any time, right, when of like Erusin for her to have had bia. Now those who say that the opinions of Rabbah, Rav Ashi, and Rav Sherevi are actually going on our Mishnah. Besula, that if you have a Besula who is an Almana, Grusha, Chalutza Minan Isuin, who is widowed or divorced or did Chalitza from marriage, Ksubason Mana, the Ksuba is a Mana Vein Loin Tanis Besulin. So here we have a Besula, right, a woman who's Becheskas Besula, but she is an Almana or a Grusha or Chalutza from Nisuin. And we're saying that her ksuba is a man of ein loin tanis besulim, and he can't come and say, "Oh, well, I thought I was marrying a besula." No, she was already married. You can't say that you thought you were marrying a besula. So, besula min anisu neichim mishkachasla. Now, how can you have a besula who's married before? For example, that they got married, that they went under the chuppah, but they never actually had bia. So Rabbah wants to argue that, what do we see? In our Mishnah, we're talking about a besula who was married, and we're saying that her ksuba is a mana, and there's no tainus besulim. We can't say, I thought I was marrying a besula. So Rabbah wants to argue, what do we see? We have a situation of this guy thought he was marrying a besula, right? She was, right? It says it's a besula who's an amana, grusha, chalutza, mina, nisuin. He thought he was marrying a besula. Turned out that she's a beula. And we're saying that her ksuba is a mana, and he can't make a tainus besulim. So what do we see? Concept b'cheskas besula. V'nim says beula, the ksuba is a mana, is 100 zuz. Rav Ashi Amar lo olam emelach ba'amal leisla klal. To which Rav Ashi says, look, I'll say in general that concept b'cheskas besula v'nim says beula, there would be no ksuba at all. V'shani hocha, it's different over here. Sharei nichnas alachupa, because after all, she had already been married before, and that's why we can assume that she's a beula. Even though it was nichnas alachupa of lo nivela, but the fact of the matter is she was married before, so it's no big, it's not so crazy to think that she's not a besula. But in general, maybe I would say that right, says Rav Ashi, that konsu b'cheskas besula v'nim says beula, maybe the ksuba is nothing. V'leichush shematachtav zin. So don't we have to be concerned that maybe she had a relationship with somebody else after the second guy did kiddushin with her, betrothed her. No, he did kiddushin and then immediately they had bia. Immediately, I assume it means that immediately they got married. I.e., there was no time for her to have had beer with somebody else. So we just saw two versions of this machlokas, right? Rabba, Rav Ashi, Rav Sherevia. One was from this brisa, which was where this girl had been married, but there were witnesses who said that they never had bia. And then Rabba says, Rav Ashi says, no, maybe dafka in that case, because she was already married before, that's why the ksuba, but in general, she would get nothing. And then the second way to understand it was based on our Mishnah, right, which was where you have a besula who became an almana, a grusha, chalutza from nisuin. We have the same thing. Rabba says that konsu b'chezkas besula v'nimtzeis beula, her ksuba is a mana, to which Rav Ashi says, no, maybe dafka because she was married before, that's why we can assume that the ksuba is a mana, but in general it would be nothing. So, the one who quotes this machlokas based on the brisa, so then certainly in our Mishnah, Rav Ashi would say that davka because she was married before, meaning in the brisa, what happens in the brisa? In the brisa, this woman was married before, right? Sorry, she was married before. And there are witnesses that say that they didn't have bia. Either they were never secluded or they weren't secluded for long enough. There are witnesses saying that they didn't have bia. And nonetheless, Rav Ashi is saying, look, she was married before, and therefore it's not so crazy to think that she's a be'ula, and therefore ksuba is a mana. So then certainly in our Mishnah, where there are no witnesses, right, it's just she was married before. For whatever reason, we assume that she's a besula. Great, somebody's knocking on something. Wait, seriously, why is somebody knocking on something? Don't they know I'm giving a daf yomi shir? Wait, sir, they don't stop. Excuse me, 1 second. I lost my train of thought. But anyways, so the Mishnah, there were no witnesses, right? She simply got married. For whatever reason, we're assuming that she's a besula, and it turns out that she's a beula, and so in that case, right? So Rav Ashi is saying, well, she was married before, so therefore it's not so crazy to think that she's a besula. So meaning, if in the situation of the brisa where there are edim to say that she never had bia, still we're going to say, well, she was married before. It's not crazy to think that she's a beula. Certainly in our Mishnah where there were no witnesses, so then certainly it's not crazy to think that she had bia before. However, but the one who says that this machlokas is based on our Mishnah, where there were no witnesses, and there Rav Ashi says, look, she was married. It's not so crazy to think that she had bia before. But in the brisa where there are witnesses, he could theoretically argue, look, I was relying upon the witnesses who said that she never had bia. So maybe in that case she wouldn't get any ksuba at all. So that is that question about how to understand machlokas between Rabba and Rav Ashi, essentially about how to understand konsu b'chezkas besula v'nimtzeis beula. Okay, now we get to a new Mishnah. Somebody who eats by his father-in-law in Yehuda. Okay, we've seen this before. Where did we see this? Did we see it yesterday? I don't know, we saw it 2 days ago. Somebody who eats by his father-in-law, right? So he's engaged. He's an arus. He's engaged, and he eats by his father-in-law in the area of Eretz Yisrael. It's called Yehuda. Shelo be'edim. There's no witnesses over there. So basically, he's secluded with his wife over there, with his his engaged wife, his wife to be, after kiddushin, by his father-in-law's house in Yehuda. There's no witnesses. So you can't make a claim that, oh, I thought she was a besula. Because in Yehuda the minig was that they would have yichud before nisun, before chuppah, before they were actually married. So therefore, if he gets married and it turns out she's not a besula, look, well, they had yichud. So we can't necessarily be super surprised that she is not a besula. Says the Gemara, Midiktania ochel. So from the fact that we say ha'ochel, somebody who happens to eat by his father-in-law's house in Yehuda, when he's in Arus, when he's engaged, which implies that not everybody, not every, how does it work? There's yeshuvs, there's moshavs. I think a yeshuv is like in a settlement, and like I think like yeshuv is like West Bank, and moshav is like not. Is that like how it goes? Whatever, I don't know. So what am I supposed to call it? A place. So there are places in Yehuda that are that like they do the whole father-in-law yichud thing, and there are places that they don't. All right. Omer Abai says Abai. Shmamina b'Yehuda nami mekomis mekomis. Wait, what did I just say? B'diktani ha'ochem echal de'ika duchta b'Yehuda nami t'lo achil. Omer Abai shmamina b'Yehuda nami mekomis mekomis yesh. So not so it's not sort of like a flat all out rule in Yehuda, but there are different sort of places where they do different things. Yesh, fine. Kidatani is learning the price. So Omer b'Yehuda says Rabbi Yehuda b'Yehuda that in the area of Eretz Yisrael called Yehuda, Barishona initially ayu miyachtin es hachosin vesakale. The chosin kale would have yichud before they got married. Sha'achas called them knisas and l'chupim before they got married. Kadesh yei libo gozba, so that he should feel comfortable with his wife to be. But in the Galilee they would not do this minig. That in Yehuda initially they would have two representatives, right? The chosin would choose a representative to represent him, and the kale would have a representative to represent her. Echad lo ve'echad lo, one for him, one for her. So that they would sort of like represent them essentially when they get married, meaning to make sure there's no foul play, right? That he is not going, if they have this cloth that they use to see if there's dam besulim, he's not going to hide it so he can claim, that she's not a besula. She's not going to, use some food coloring, whatever it might be. So her representative protects her, his representative protects his interests. All right. In Galilee, they didn't do this. Initially in Judah, these representatives would sleep in the house that the chas and kale are sleeping in. But in the Galilee they did not do this. And then the Brisa concludes that in anybody who does not do this minig, anybody who doesn't do this, we don't know what this is, if you didn't do this, well then you can't make a tanis besulim, i.e. to avoid to flip around a double negative into positive. If you want to make a tanis besulim, so then make sure to do these things. Okay, fine. Double negatives. I just had that in the computer programming. So you know what I did? I changed it to positive. I don't do so good with double negatives. We had this validation. They were validating that a field was required, and the validation rule was a double negative. So I flipped it into a positive. It still has to go through code review, but I don't know. Hopefully there won't be any problems. I think it's much easier to understand when something's positive versus two negatives. That was confusing. I get confused. Fine. Now, what is that double negative going on? So if we're talking about the ratio, what was the ratio? That in Yehuda, they would have yichud before the chuppah. So, and we're saying that that if you didn't have this minig, i.e. if you didn't have yichud, so then you can't make the tanis besulim. I.e. in order to be able to make a tanis besulim, you have to have yichud. Well, kol shenog mi ba'i what? Ilema aresha kol shenog mi ba'i. But then it should be anybody who did have yichud cannot make a tanis besulim, because we have to assume that maybe they had bia. Ela aseifa. So if you want to say that whoever didn't do this minig, then cannot make, i.e. if you have to do this minig in order to be able to make a tanis besulim, so it's talking about the seifa. Kol shelo mujmash mi ba'i. But if we're talking about the seifa, right? Well then, and we're saying that in order to have a tanis besulim, you have to have these people, and if you didn't have these representatives, then you can't make a tanis besulim. Well, what it should say is kol shel mujmosh. Somebody, right? If there was no representative of the girl making sure that he wasn't pulling any funny stuff, right? So meaning right? She has to have a representative making sure that he's not, hiding the cloth or whatever, in order so that he can make a tanis besulim. But if there's nobody representing her interests, so then he can't make a tanis besulim because we can't trust him. Well, then it should have to say kol shelo mushmash, not kol shelo nohag, because we're talking about the shoshvinin, not about the right. So davka say mushmash as opposed to nohag. So Marabai the olam areisha. So really, it's talking about the first part. It's talking about the yichud utni kol shel nohag. And say dafka, instead of saying kol shel lo nohag, say kol shel nohag. That anybody who has this minig, that anywhere in Judah where they would have yichud, so if they had yichud, then you cannot make a tanis besulim. Kol shel lo nohag katani, says Rav Tabai, but it says kol shel lo nohag. Anybody who didn't have this minig. Sorry for the double negatives. It's kind of confusing. But it says anybody who didn't have this minig, not anybody who does have this minig, so we have to stick with what it says. Rather says, Rav Hachikam, this is what it means. Kol shelo minig galil begalil, ela minig Yehuda begalil, and yochol liton tanis besulim. What it means is kol shelo noag, it means anybody in the Galilee who did not do the minig of the Galilee, which is to avoid yichud before the chuppah. Rather, what they did was, they did like the minig of Yehuda, where they had yichud before the chuppah, so then they're unable to make a tanis besulim. So kol shelo noag, so anybody in the Galilee who did not do like the minig of the Galilee, instead they did like the minig of Yehuda, i.e. they had yichud before the chuppah, so then they cannot make a tanis besulim. Rav Ashi Omar le'olam ha'seifa utni kol shelo mushmos. Whereas Rav Ashi says no, really, it is talking about the seifa, talking about the representatives, and then so instead of saying kol shelo noag, I mean kol shelo mushmash. It should say that if there was no representative of the girl making sure, protecting her interests, so if there was no representative, so then he cannot make a tanis besulim, because how do we know that there was no sort of foul play and that he didn't just hide the cloth or anything like that? All right, very interesting stuff. Says the Mishnah, achas hamones yisrael v'achas hamones kohanim, whether you have an almone who's a bas kohen, whether you have an almone who's a bas Yisrael, ksubas almone, there's no difference. The ksube of an almone is 100 zuz. Bezdin shel kohanim, are you govern the b'sula arba meos. Now there was a court of kohanim who had their own rules. They would say that a b'sula, that's a bas kohen, is very special. Her ksubah is 400 zuz. And the rabbis didn't prevent them. Says the Gemara, Tana va'amonas kohanim ksubasa ma saim. So we have a brayso that says that the ksuba of an almana bas kohen was taka 200 zuz. But then we learn in our Mishnah, achas amonas Yisrael, v'achas amonas kohanim ksubas almana. But doesn't our Mishnah say that the ksuba of an almana is always 100 zuz? So Rav Ashi shtei takanus hava. So Rav Ashi says, look, it was a two-step process. Meikara initially takinu livsula arba meus zuz. For the amona, initially these sort of courts of kohanim, they would say that for a bas kohen besula, her ksuba is 400 zuz, but for a bas kohen amona, the ksuba is 100. However, kevin dechazud demizalz lebehu. But since, people were, it was, a besula is 400 zuz and almana is 100 zuz. What does that make it look like, the almana? 25%, your ksuba is 25% the value of the ksuba of a besula. Makes the almana look not so great. It's demeaning. So takinu lu mason. So they said that the ksuba of an almana, bas kohen, is 200. So a besula is 400, but almana is 200. Kevin de chazu de kaparshan minayu. But then they saw that nobody wanted to marry an almana bas kohen. The army, because they would reason, adnazvin an almanas kohanim nezel nesev besula bas Yisrael, rather than marrying an almana bas kohen for 200 zuz, and the ksuba will be 200 zuz, may as well marry a besula bas Yisrael for the same 200 zuz, the same 200 obligation. So So they said, you know what? Okay, let's put it back at 100 zuz. All right, fine. Okay, let me tell you. So apparently these, okay, so this the Bezdin of Kohanim, so they said that the ksuba of a besula bas kohen would be 400 zuz, and then the Amana bas kohen was initially 100. They made it 200, then they put it back to 100. All right. Bezdin shokanim b'chulei. So Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel says Rav Yehuda didn't Shmuel lo bezdin shokanim b'vadamu. Now this is not limited to a bezdin of priests. Even very fancy families, very fancy Yisrael families. If they want to do like the Kohanim do, Osin, they can, right? So you have a very fancy family, and they decide that their daughters need a ksuba of 400 zuz. Okay, so they could do that as well. Meizvei, we have a kasha. Harotza lasos kiderech shekohanim Osin. That we have a brayse that says that if they want to do like the way that the Kohanim do, Kugon, for example, Bas Yisrael lekoyin. If a Bas Yisrael marries a koyin, and they want the ksuba to be 400, Uvas koyin Yisrael, or a Bas koyin who marries a Yisrael, Osin, look, they could do it. So we're saying Bas Yisrael lekoyin, Bas koyin Yisrael who Teika tzad kehuna. So Davka, if there's a koyin in the mix, a Bas Kohen Yisrael or Bas Yisrael a Kohen, if one of them is a Kohen, so it sounds like only there can they sort of have this increased Ksubis. The Yisrael of a Bas Yisrael, but a Bas Yisrael marrying a Yisrael, I don't care how fancy they are, it doesn't sound like they can mess with the price of a Ksuba. No, lo mi boya ka'amar. No, it's actually saying lo mi boya, not only this, but rather that. Lo mi boya bas Yisrael Yisrael de lo motzi omer la aluye kama aleino loch. Look, certainly in the case of a Bas Yisrael to a Yisrael, if they want to charge, if they want to say, look, we need the ksuba to be more, okay, they could do that, fine. Like, what's the argument you're going to make against it, really? Have a Bas Yisrael a kohen, but a Bas Yisrael to a kohen, de motzi omer la, that the kohen could respond and say, look, aluye kama aleino loch. I know you're very fancy, but I'm a kohen. I might say that she should be unable to have a very fancy, special, increased ksuba, and that even in that case, even though he's a kohen, he can say, look, but I come from a priest family, the family of priests. Still, if she wants to have a more expensive ksuba, so that is possible. New Mishnah, so you have a fellow who gets married, and it turns out that his wife is not a besula. He omers misherastani nenasti. She says, look, when you betrothed me, when we got engaged, I was a besula. And then I got raped after the erisin. And therefore, sorry, dude, the ksuba is still 200. V'omer loki. He says, no, not true. Ela ad shelo erastich. He says, no, you had a relationship with somebody else before the Kiddushin, and this is a mekach tos, you should get gunished. You should get nothing. Zilch, no. Rabbi Gamliel says that we trust her, and therefore our ksuba is 200 zuz. Rabbi Yoshua Omer says, Rabbi Yoshua, lo mi pia anuchayin, we don't live based on her opinions, ela arezo b'chezkas be'ula, based on her arguments. Rather, she has the chazaka of being a be'ula, ad shelo tisaris, before she was engaged, ve'it also, and she tricked him, ad shetavi raya l'dver, until she brings a proof, and if she doesn't bring a proof, then we can't believe her, and her ksuba is null, since he thought that she was a besula, and it's a mekach tos, it was a mistaken marriage. Says the Gemara Itmar, it was stated in an unrelated case, Monoli biyadach, Ruvain says to Shimon, you owe me $100. What does Shimon say? Ich weiß nicht. I don't know. That's what he says. Reuben says, Shimon, you owe me $100. Shimon says, Ich weiß nicht. I don't know. Rav Yehuda v'Rav Huna Amrei Chayiv, Rav Nachman v'Rav Yochanan Amrei Potter. So Rav Huna and Rav Yehuda say Chayiv, that Shimon has to pay the $100 to Reuben. Rav Nachman v'Rav Yochanan Amrei Potter. Rav Nachman of Yochanan says that Shimon does not need to pay the $100 to Reuven. Rav Huna Rav Yehuda Amar Chayiv. The reason why Rav Huna and Rav Yehuda say that Shimon does need to pay $100 to, the reason that Shimon has to pay $100 to Reuven, that we trust Reuven, is because Bari V'Shema Bari Odif. Friends, you've heard this before? it's a Gavaldiga Yisod that Bari V'Shema Bari Adif. When you have something that's certain and something that's uncertain, the certainty is stronger. So if Reuven is coming and saying, Shimon, you owe me $100, and Shimon's saying, Ich weiß nicht, I don't know. So Reuven's saying, you owe me. Shimon's saying, I don't know. So whose argument is stronger? Reuven's argument. So therefore, we trust Reuven, and Shimon has to pay back. Shimon has to pay back Reuven. Rav Nachman Rav Yochanan Amei Potter. The reason why Rav Nachman and Rav Yochanan say that Shimon does not have to pay Reuven is because Uki Mamon B'Chezkas Mareh. Because who's got the money right now? Shimon has the money right now. So we don't know what the deal is. Reuven says, you owe me money. Shimon says, I don't know. What do? Don't do anything. Just leave things status quo. Shimon's got the money right now. Shimon keeps the money right now. Okay, fine. Omelei Abai Rav Yosef says Abai to Rav Yosef, Hadu Rav Huna Rav Yehuda Dishmuli. Says Abai to Rav Yosef that the opinions of Rav Huna and Rav Yehuda that Bari V'Shema Bari Adif is actually the opinion of Shmuel. The Tanan is we learn in the Mishnah. Haisimu Uberis. We're going to learn this Mishnah tomorrow. If she was pregnant, V'Amrula, and they said to her, Mativa shel Uber Zeh, Nu, tell us about your pregnancy. Meish Ploni V'Chayinu, and she says, well, it's from so and so, and he's a kohen. Rabbi Gamliel Rabbi Eliezer Om Ne'menes, says Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer that we believe her. Ve'omer Rav Yehuda Omer Shmuel, and says Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, Alacha Rabbi Gamliel, that Alacha is like Rabbi Gamliel, that we believe her. Ve'omerle Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda to Rav Yehuda, Shinina, and says Rav Shmuel to Rav Yehuda, Bar Yehuda to Rav Yehuda, Shinina, sharp one. Omar Tlon Mishmei de Shmuel, you said to us in the name of Shmuel, Halacha Rabbi Gamliel Av Bar Yishona. That the halacha is like Rabbi Gamliel also in the first case, in our Mishnah, when that we just learned. Right? He says, I thought I married a Besula, turns out that she's a Bula. She says, look, that right, that she was raped after Erisin, and tough luck to you. And Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer say that we trust her. And says Shmuel that the halacha is like Rabbi Gamliel there as well. My Av Barishona, what does it mean even in our case, in our Mishnah? Even though you could say, keep the money where it is, that he has the money right now, so just keep it where it is, and she wouldn't get anything. Or Rabbi Gamliel, Bari Adif, nonetheless, Rabbi Gamliel is saying that Bari is Adif, that if she's saying no, so then we trust her, she's making a definitive argument, and she gets the money. So we see that Shmuel's opinion is that the halacha is like Rabbi Gamliel, that Bari V'Shema, Bari Adif, that the definitive argument is stronger, which is just like what Rav Huna and Rav Yehuda are saying in the case of Reuven and Shimon with the $100, that Reuven gets the money because he's making the definitive argument. So now it says the Gemara, Lema Rav Yehuda Rav Huna the Amik Rabbi Gamliel. So let's say that Rav Yehuda and Rav Huna, in the case of Reuven and Shimon and the $100, and they're saying Bari V'Shema Bari Adif, holds like Rabbi Gamliel, who's saying in our Mishnah, Bari V'Shema Bari Adif. Rav Nachman and Rav Yochanan the Amik Rabbi Yeshua. And Rav Nachman and Rav Yochanan, who say that Uki Mamonu B'Chezkas Mari, that Shimon right now has the money, leave it with him, says like Rabbi Yeshua, who says in our Mishnah that he doesn't have to pay her anything until she proves that in fact she was raped after Erisin and Nistach Vasadeh. Amalach Rav Nachman would respond and say, Ma pitom, on a da'ami afilu Rabbi Gamliel, that I, who say over here, by Reuven and Shimon and the $100, that Uki Mamonu B'Chezkas Mareh, that keep the money where it is, I would say even like Rabbi Gamliel would nonetheless agree with me, because Ad Kano Ka'am Rabbi Gamliel Hasam, the only reason why Rabbi Gamliel says by the Ksubis, when she says Misher Astanina and Nasti V'Nistach Vasadeu, that we trust her, is Ela De'ika Migo, because if she was lying, then she would have made an even better argument. Because even when she says Misher Astanina and Nasti, if he's a Kohen, so then they can't stay together anymore. Because a Kohen, even if his wife was raped against her will, they cannot remain married. So therefore, if she was lying, she wouldn't, make the argument of Misha Erastanin and Nasti that she was raped, she can make a better argument if she was lying and say that she was Misherastani Mukas Eitz. Right? She could say Mukas Eitz, in which case you could say Nistach Basadeu, and they could even still remain together, because by Mukas Eitz they could remain together. So that was a better argument. So you could say, so Rav Nachman would say that the only reason why Rabbi Gamliel says in our mission that we could trust her is because we could trust her, because if she was lying, she would have made a better argument of Mukas Eitz rather than Mishterastani Nasti. But over here, in the case of Reuven and Shimon and the $100, what better argument could Reuven have made that we should say that because he could have made a better argument, that's why we trust him, and he's being an honest guy? No, there's no better argument, and therefore, how do I know that he's being particularly honest? And therefore, we'll say, Uki mamon b'cheskas mari, just keep the money where it is. Shimon doesn't have to pay back Reuven. Inami, or else. The only reason why Rabbi Gamliel says, in our case regarding the Ksubis, that we trust her that she was raped, because we say, well, she was born a Basula, and therefore, what's the chazaka? The chazaka is that she was a Basula at the time that she got engaged, and therefore, nistach basadeu, she was a Basula at the time that she was engaged. That's the chazaka. But what chazaka is there to say that Reuven should really be trustworthy? So therefore, that is why Rav Nachman says, in this case, Shimon just keeps the money, because we keep the money where it is. Lahai. Fine. So, Achinami Mistabra, and this talk also makes sense to say, right, Kidikam Shanina and Rav Nachman Udam Rav Gamliel. It makes sense to say that Rav Nachman would be in agreement with Rav Gamliel, because then we would be in a problem, because the Karmel and Rav Nachman Bedine, because we say in general that the halacha is like Rav Nachman when it comes to dine, to cases. For example, this Reuven and Shimon case with the $100. So we say that the halacha is like Rav Nachman in cases like this, and therefore we would say Uki Mamona Achaz Kasa, rather than like Rav Huna and Rav Yehuda who are saying Bari V'Shem and Bari Adif. Uveha Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel halacha Rabban Gamliel, and yet when it comes to the Ksuba, Rav Yehuda saying the name of Shmuel that the halacha is like Rabban Gamliel, which is Bari V'Shem and Bari Adif. So it makes sense to say that Rav Nachman agrees with Rabban Gamliel, because that way, because if we say that Rav Nachman and Rabban Gamliel are holding differently, well then how can we hold like Rav Nachman in one place and say Uki Mamona Chaz Kase, and yet paskin like Rabban Gamliel in our Mishnah that Bari V'Shem and Bari Adif, and not like Rabbi Yoshua, who seems to be saying keep the money where it is? So rather it must be, like we explained, Alav Shmamina, Kedim Shanina and Shmamina, rather it must be like we explained, that Rabbi Gamliel only says Bari V'Shem and Bari Adif in this case, either because Migo, she could have made a better argument if she was lying, or because the chazaka is that she was a Besula when she got married. But in the case of the $100, Rabbi Gamliel would be in agreement with Rav Nachman that here we would say Uki Mamona Chaz Kase, keep the money where it is, because there's no reason to say that Reuven is particularly trustworthy over here. Friends, that was our Yud Beis of Masechta Ksubis. We did a whole bunch of, we really covered quite a lot on this daf, and we started off with the machlokas. We saw it now, machlokas in Rabba and Rav Ashi, essentially, about how we trust a situation of Konse B'cheskas Besula V'nimtzeis Be'ula. Rabba says that she would get 100 zuz, whereas Rav Ashi says not necessarily, she maybe might get nothing. We then saw this mission about the Minigan Yehuda, which was to have Yichud before the Chasana. We then saw that there were these Kohanim who would actually charge more for the Ksuba of their daughters, that a Besula would be 400, and then an Almana was initially 100, then 200, then back to 100. And then we saw Machlokas, right, between Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yoshua about what happens in a situation where he thought he was marrying a Basula. It turns out that she's a Be'ula, and her argument is, look, when you betrothed me, I was a Basula, but then I got raped, and sorry, tough luck, the Ksuba is 200, whereas Rabbi Yeshua says we can't necessarily trust her. We tried to tie that into a Machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and Rav Huna on the one hand, and Rav Nachman and Rabbi Yochanan on the other, regarding when Shimon owes $100 to Reuven. Do we say Bari V'Shem and Bari Adif, that definitive argument is stronger than the Safek argument, and therefore we trust Reuven? Or do we say that Uki Mamona Chaz Kase, that we keep the money where it is, and that Shimon would just hold on to the money. Okay, then we tried to tie it back into our Mishnah to say that Rav Huna and Rav Yehuda Dafka hold like Rav Gamliel, and Rav Nachman and Rav Yochanan hold like Rav Yoshua, but we said we could argue that Rav Nachman even holds like Rav Gamliel, which we said is taka better because we hold like Rav Nachman Bedine, Rav Nachman, that the halacha is like Rav Nachman, I guess by financial matters, whatever, so it would make sense, and the halacha is like Rav Gamliel here, so it makes sense to say that they are in line. Friends, that was Daf Yud Beis of Masechta Ksubis. I hope you enjoyed. Peace out.